part of the problem here, surely, is that we're being told this prorogation is happening to set out the domestic agenda, to sort out the Queen's speech. We know that's not the case, don't we?
Well, Stephen, I think there's a lot of froth and actually, if I may say so, a certain amount of manufactured anger around this issue. I mean, let's just look objectively at what is happening here. This parliamentary session has been running for a long time. In fact, it's the longest parliamentary session for almost 400 years. And the idea that we have a Queen's speech, we have a new session, that is a perfectly normal routine thing. Happens normally once a year. As I said, this session has been running for a long period of time. And this is about setting out an exciting agenda that the Conservative Party and the Prime Minister has. We've already made it clear that we want to make sure that we leave the European Union. Brexit happens by the 31st of October, no ifs, no buts. But then actually, across the country, what people want is for us to focus on the domestic agenda. The Prime Minister has shown an enormous amount of energy since he's come into place, and he's already set out what people want to see, which is more money for the NHS in terms of front line, more money for schools, and more money for policing. That is our agenda, and that is what resonates with people on the doorstep.
While that may very well be true, the Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, was, as you know, caught on camera making comments which were effectively saying, yeah, we've got the domestic agenda, but actually the timing of this and the length of this prorogation is about getting through Brexit.
Well, as I said, if you have a look at this is perfectly normal. And actually, for the past 80 years, Parliament has always not sat during a large part of September and the early part of October because we have a conference season. And before the summer recess, there was no discussion from any of the parties that somehow this shouldn't happen. This is just a recent issue that seems to have come up. And if you look at the number of sitting days where Parliament will not be sitting as a result of us going forward for this new session of the Queen's speech, it's literally a handful of days. There is plenty of time when we go back next week to have a discussion about Brexit. There'll be plenty of time to discuss Brexit and our agenda either side of the European Union meeting that takes place in the middle of October. So the idea that somehow we are shutting down debate, I think, is completely wrong.
And yet, if we look at some details from the House of Commons library, we've got a list of how long prorogation has gone on for since 2010. On average, 8 days, and now we're looking at about 34. I mean, people are going to look at that suspiciously.
Well, as I said, the idea that this is sort of somehow unusual, I think it's completely unfair. Parliament was anyway not going to be sitting for a large period of time. And if you look at the number of sitting days where it won't be sitting, where it might have done, is literally a handful. So I think there is a lot of froth around this. The key issue is there's plenty of time for debate. You've already heard from one of my colleagues there'll be a debate next week on this. There'll be a debate when we return in October. But the key thing from the government's perspective is that we will be planning, we will be leaving the European Union on the 31st of October, no ifs, no buts, and then focusing on that really important domestic agenda. I just say to you, Stephen, I knock on doors like all my colleagues week after week. Out there in the doorsteps of certainly Reading, what people want to see is for us to get Brexit done, to get that out of the way, and then to refocus on the issues that matter to them on a day-to-day basis, and that is more police, more funding for schools, more money for the front line, the NHS, and that is what the Prime Minister has already set out. And we will see further announcements, I'm sure, at the spending review on Wednesday.
And yet, all this whole argument around Brexit and the side that won was about taking back control and about this huge piece of democracy that we put in place, about getting back sovereignty for the United Kingdom and the UK Parliament. This is removing, so whether you think this is a full 35 days or whether it's just 4 or 5 days in real terms that Parliament isn't going to be sitting, the reality is it is removing some of the say that parliamentarians can have on this issue. How is that a democratic move?
Well, I would disagree with that. We've had 3 years of discussion around Brexit. There is time for more discussion around Brexit. And also, it's fundamentally worth remembering that the European Council will take place in the middle of October. So we won't know whether there is a deal. We certainly want a deal. That's what the Prime Minister has set out very clearly. We want to have a deal, but we won't know the details of that until the 18th of October. As I said, there's plenty of time after that to debate not just the domestic agenda, but also any future deal when it comes to Brexit.
You mentioned plenty of time before as well, these additional days that we've got before. I mean, next week is going to be a very busy week for you all. If it does get through the House of Commons, that they get a majority saying action needs to be taken, looking at potentially extending Article 50. Will the Prime Minister be compelled to do that?
Well, look, I mean, I campaigned to Remain, I voted to Remain, but I was very clear at the time of the referendum that I would respect the outcome of that referendum. And the outcome was, very clearly, that we should leave the European Union. It was very clear-cut. Labour MPs, Conservative MPs, we all stood on manifestos in 2017 saying that we would respect the referendum. That is what we now need to do. And it's interesting, Stephen, you've got John McDonnell coming on after this. John McDonnell, Jeremy Corbyn, they all said at the time that we should respect the referendum, otherwise there would be a lack of trust in democratic processes. And actually, that's what happened. You know, if you look at what happened in the local elections and the European elections, that was a reaction to the fact that the two main parties did not follow through on leaving the European Union when we said we would.
But, as I said, there is a possibility next week that you may not have the numbers and that there may be some movement against the government position here, and it may require the Prime Minister to seek an extension. Will he do it? Is he compelled to do it?
Well, firstly, we'll have to wait and see. I'm not going to prejudge what may or may not happen next week. The fundamental point, though, is that for Conservative colleagues, for Labour colleagues, and I would say this to actually all parliamentarians, is that we must respect the outcome of the referendum. And also, we need to give the Prime Minister time to get this new deal. You know, by all accounts, he had a really good G7 meeting. He had good interactions with some of his EU counterparts. We have made very clear that in September we're happy to meet twice a week between our two negotiating teams, have other discussions required, but we want to get a deal. But there is a fundamental point here, which the Prime Minister conveyed at the G7 as well to some of his counterparts, which is that we want any future agreement not to have the backstop. Now, I've read all the stuff that's gone on today in the papers and all the rest of it. The reality is that the previous withdrawal agreement, which contained the backstop, did not pass on 3 occasions. Didn't pass then, it won't pass again. And in fact, having the backstop also potentially makes us rule takers from the EU for forever. That is not what we want. We want that out. We want a deal, but we will be leaving on the 31st of October. No ifs, no buts.
But this is where it gets complicated and where I think people at home start to tear their hair out. You say you want a deal. You want the backstop out. That's absolutely crucial to that deal. Michel Barnier, and indeed the rest of the EU negotiating team on this, say that is not going to happen. That is absolutely not on the table. Why don't you just therefore come out and say, actually, we're just gunning for a no deal now?
Well, we've said we want a deal, and actually, you talk about the EU, it takes two to tango. What we are doing very clearly is setting out the case that we want to have a deal. We've set out the parameters for that, and we've said we're prepared to have that discussion. And the Prime Minister had some good discussions at the G7. But what we're also doing is preparing for the eventuality, potentially, of a no deal. We've turbocharged the work that we're doing there, so we are ready. And the best way, Stephen, and the Prime Minister made this very clear, the best way of making sure we get a deal is to demonstrate that we are ready for no deal.
But again, it's back to that point of, do we believe what politicians are saying when they say we're really pushing for a deal here, but when we're told categorically what you are asking for will not happen? Why can't politicians then turn around and say, well, actually, we know we're not going to get this, so we're going for a no deal?
Well, there is a negotiation which is ongoing. We hope that we will end up with a deal. We've made it very clear what we would like on this, and let's see where we get to. But the fundamental point is that we need to be ready for no deal. We are doing absolutely that, and we will be leaving on the 31st of October, no ifs, no buts. And no one should be in any doubt about that. You talk about frustration out there in the country. The frustration in the country, for very many people, is that we have not yet left. That's what people voted for. There was a majority for us to leave the European Union. We have not delivered. We must do this by the 31st of October. And you talk about another extension. The reality is, another extension, we already had 2, by the way, Stephen. They've not led to anything. Another extension is not a destination. What another extension is another big loss of trust in democratic processes, and that is absolutely something that we as politicians collectively have to avoid.
A lot of it hangs on the balance, of course, as to what happens next week, what legislation is put forward, whether others apart from the government can take control of the order papers. If a number of your colleagues, the likes of David Gauke, turn round and rebel, should they lose the whip?
Well, I've seen some of this sort of stuff in the papers. I'm not going to preempt any discussions that may or may not be taking place around that. But there is a fundamental point here, which is that we all stood on manifestos saying that we would respect the outcome of the referendum, and we need to honour that. And what I would say to my colleagues is that actually siding with the likes of Jeremy Corbyn, John McDonnell, they need to reflect very clearly what these people want. They do not want a delay in Brexit. They want to frustrate Brexit. And you've just heard David Gauke talk about the fact that he doesn't want to see Jeremy Corbyn leading the country. Well, you need to be very clear whose side you're on. Are you on the side of people who want to frustrate Brexit, people who would actually ruin the economy, people who, frankly, at the end of the day, are not prepared to stand up for Britain? Or do you want to stand with the people, deliver on the referendum result?
Well, in terms of the people, it ultimately looks like it could be heading back towards the people, doesn't it? I mean, if we end up with effectively a stalemate in Parliament this coming week, if you say we are definitely leaving, no ifs, no buts, but Parliament frustrates that this week, which is a very real possibility, at what point then does the Prime Minister turn around and say, we've got to have an election? Even if it's before Brexit, we've got to have an election.
Well, we had an election in 2015, we had a referendum in 2016, we had another election in 2017. What people actually in this country want, and what the Prime Minister wants, and what I want, is for us to deliver on Brexit. And then get back to that domestic agenda, which is what constituents up and down the country want to see. I can't tell you what is going to happen next week. I mean, you heard my colleague David Gauke not setting out what those who may try and do something will try and do. So I can't really sort of comment on that. All I would say to you is it's very clear from the government's perspective is that we will be leaving on the 31st of October. No ifs, no buts. And actually, from the government's point of view, the agenda for next week is very clear. The big issue is the discussion on the spending review, which the Chancellor will pronounce on. And that will set out that domestic agenda going forward ahead of a Queen's speech. And as I said, the Prime Minister has already been very clear, more money for the NHS, more police officers, more money for schools. That is what constituents, people in the country want. That is what this government is going to be delivering.